A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Schon 1000 Shabbos at the Gitter.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too late.
Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode is going to be about the Ben Ish Chai, the life and times of Rav Yosef Chaim, or Chacham Yosef Chaim, of Baghdad, who was one of the greatest and most important leaders of the Iraqi Jewish community, for sure, of the 19th century. He lived from 1835 to 1909, born into a very important family. His father, Rebbe Eliyahu Chaim, was already a leader of the community, and even more so, his grandfather, Rabbi Moshe Chaim. Rabbi Moshe Chaim or Moshe Chaim, I don't remember. Either way, he was a very important rabbi and prominent leader of the Baghdad Jewish community. His grandfather having been already a prominent leader at the end of the 18th century. They were also a wealthy family. They were part of the rabbinical elite. A very, very important family. So, Reb Yosef Chaim, who later came to be known by his most famous set of Sfarim, even though he had many, many others with various other titles, but his most famous set of Sfarim was called the Ben Ish Chai, so that's how he's known to posterity, but his name was Rabbi Yosef Chaim. Either way, he succeeded his father, Rebbe Eliyahu, upon his passing in 1859, when he's a relatively young man, 24 years old. So he held his position in the Baghdad Jewish community for exactly 50 years, a half a century. And during this time, he combined so many unique talents that it's almost unmatched for his time or perhaps any other time in Jewish history. He's really multi-talented and multi-forms of leadership. Obviously, first and foremost, he was a great Torah scholar, almost an unparalleled Torah scholar in his environment. He was a very influential psak in halacha. He was a community leader, an active community leader. He was a really prolific author, wrote in so many different areas. He was a very, very famous, one of his most famous traits was he was an orator, a great speaker, really dynamic, charismatic speaker. He was a great Kabbalist, very famous for his Kabbalah, for his studies and for his teachings and for his Sfarim in Kabbalah. Also, he was a poet. Also, the 19th century, not that common. Wrote, I think, about 200 poems, of which we have some 50-some-odd poems of his. He was also wealthy at times in his life, involved in the family business, less active than his brothers were, but he was considered a partner in the family business. He was also a fundraiser for many different causes, a builder of Torah institutions, commentator in so many different areas of Torah scholarship, and he spoke not just to scholars, but to the masses. And in speaking to the masses, he was a great author of parables and stories and so much more. Very, very interesting life. So I've always wanted to explore it more, and this is a great opportunity to do so. In the 19th century in general was a very good time for Baghdad Iraqi Jewry. I would not refer to it as a golden age because they had even better times earlier than that, but it was a relatively benign, flourishing scholarship, flourishing religious life, and relatively good economic conditions. This is under the Ottoman Empire, the Iraq was under the Ottoman Empire for about 400 years, and it was a crucial part. The Baghdad Jewish community was a crucial part of an axis of the major Jewish communities of the Ottoman Empire. We take to the west, we have the capital of the Ottoman Empire and the most prestigious Jewish community there, Constantinople, which is today's Istanbul. Another city in Turkey that had a very prominent Jewish community of the Ottoman Empire was Smyrna. Today that's Izmir, I think, both in Turkey. Both Constantinople and Smyrna were in Turkey. Then you had Saloniki in Greece, Damascus in Syria, Yerushalayim, of course, and that's all within the Ottoman Empire. And then beyond the borders of the Ottoman Empire to the east, Baghdad is connected to those communities as well, such as Persia, which was very much under the influence of the Baghdad rabbinate over the centuries, and India. The Indian Jewish communities that arose. There's the ancient Indian Jewish communities. I'm not talking about those. Those are native Indian, so to speak. But there's more modern Indian Jewish communities in the 19th century, which primarily were Baghdad and Iraqi Jews who followed the trade routes of the British Empire and became, for the most part, phenomenally wealthy in the process. And they lived in the great emerging Indian cities in British India in the 18th and 19th centuries, in Calcutta and what was then known as Bombay. I think it's Mumbai today. And they kept a very strong connection to their native Baghdad. And, of course, all the way to the Far East, because those Indian Iraqi Jews continued even further east into China, reaching Shanghai eventually by the late 19th, early 20th centuries. So in a certain way, Baghdad was a scholarly aristocracy in the wider Eastern or Sephardic world, kind of like Brisk, but just much more prestigious than that. The Baghdad Jews viewed themselves as the Jews of Bavel, as the Babylonian ancient Bavel Jewish community, and prestigious and important and historic Jewish community, and they're augmented by the Sephardic influence following the expulsion from Spain in 1492. So Sephardic Jews eventually make it to Baghdad as well. It's in the Ottoman Empire, and Sephardic Jews made it all over the Ottoman Empire. So together with this Bavel tradition, augmented by the Sephardic traditions, so the Baghdad Jews were very proud, very ancient, and a very important Jewish community. It was a seat of rabbinics, of scholarliness, of yeshivas, of ancient traditions, and at times also great wealth. So it's very much at the center of the Sephardic world. So now, as a country, it was Iraq or Bavel, however you want to refer to Babylon as a country. So the Jewish community is, like I said, 2,500, 3,000 years old there. One of the oldest in the world. I mean, it's probably the only Jewish community outside of Israel that has as much Jewish history as Israel. I mean, it's a really, really ancient Jewish community with very rich history, and I think we should do a few episodes about Iraqi Jewry in general. But they went through, the country itself went through all kinds of empires and conquests and glory times of the ancient times of Bavel, when it was the center of the Jewish world. And then there's the Muslim conquest, and then later the Sephardic influence post-expulsion, and down to the Ottoman Empire. So that's what we're looking at when we finally come to the 19th century, when the Ben Ish Chai is born into this community, and he's part of that elite. He's part of like I said before, his family is among the rabbinical communal leadership, financial aristocracy, with his father and grandfather having already played crucial roles in the Baghdad community. He studies in the most prominent yeshiva in Baghdad at the time, which is also something we should talk about at another opportunity, the Beit Zilcha Yeshiva, very, very famous and important yeshiva in Iraq. And the Rosh Yeshiva at the time, in the 19th century, this is the golden age of the Beit Zilcha Yeshiva, was one of the greatest tzaddikim and Rosh Yeshiva in Iraqi history, Rav Abdallah Somech. The Somech family in general, generations in Iraq, very prominent rabbis, and Rav Abdallah Somech was one of the most important Iraqi rabbinical figures of the 19th century, and he headed the Beit Zilcha Yeshiva during this important time. I just want to, as a side point, make a word about Bavli or Iraqi Babylonian Jewish names. It seems, just from just a cursory glance at some of the most famous names in Bavli Jewish history, that they really were not particular about naming what we would stereotypically refer to as Jewish names. They had no problem having Arabic-sounding names, Iraqi-sounding names, prominent people, rabbis. Their given name was Arabic, what we would, from the outside call non-Jewish sounding native Iraqi names. So, it's something to keep in mind when we, make judgments about what is considered Jewish and what's not considered Jewish, and must one have a Jewish name? It seems that in the most ancient and one of the most important historically Jewish communities in the world that had some of the greatest Talmidei Chachamim ever, it seems that they didn't care that much about having a generic biblical Jewish type of a name. In any event, that was parenthetical. Going back to the topic, the Ben Ish Chai marries at the age of 17, which was relatively common at the time, into the Somech family. He actually married into his Rebbe's family, not his Rebbe's daughter, like an uncle or something, a cousin. And the Ben Ish Chai and his wife had a son and daughter. And the Ben Ish Chai formally joins his four brothers in their business ventures, but he's an inactive or silent partner. In other words, his name is on the documents, but he is not that active in the business because his brothers respected that he was a Torah scholar, and he spent much more of his time in Torah study, engaged in Torah study. The Ben Ish Chai had a very, very important relationship throughout his life with the land of Israel. At the end of his life is his most famous chapter. It's perhaps one of his most important pieces of his legacy that's with us till today. There was a Iraqi Baghdad Jew who lived in Calcutta in India named Yosef Avraham Shalom. And he was very, very wealthy. And like I said before, the Baghdadi Jews who lived in India and amassed great wealth, they kept a very close relationship with their community back home, even generations later, interestingly enough. And he sought advice, and this is in the last years of the Ben Ish Chai's life, so we're jumping ahead a bit here, just a great story, so I wanted to get it out right away. He asked the Ben Ish Chai, all the way at the end of his life, and Ben Ish Chai passed away in 1909, so shortly before that, he wanted this Yosef Avraham Shalom wanted to make an endowment, some sort of funds, trust fund, to build a hospital in the old yeshiva of Yerushalayim to help the poor and the sick of Yerushalayim. This would be a free healthcare medical hospital. And the Ben Ish Chai says there are already enough hospitals. Shaarei Tzedek had already opened up as a modern hospital in 1902 in Yerushalayim, and even earlier than that, there was less modern hospitals in the old city of Yerushalayim. So he said they have enough hospitals. Why don't you establish a yeshiva, an elite yeshiva with a yeshiva community built around that, and your endowment fund will be for that. That's better investment for your money. And that's exactly what Yosef Avraham Shalom did. He followed the Ben Ish Chai's advice. And eventually, it took some time because World War I interrupted, and in the interim, the Ben Ish Chai passed away. So eventually, in 1923, the Porat Yosef yeshiva opened up, which became the flagship yeshiva of the Sephardic world. It opened up in the old city of Yerushalayim, and it opened up as a massive, prominent yeshiva right at the edge of the Jewish quarter, overlooking the Kosel, and it remains there till today. Of course, there's another branch in Geula, because after 1948, there was this evacuation from the Jewish quarter because the Jordanians occupied the Jewish quarter. So they reopened the original branch in the Old City after 1967, the Six-Day War. So now there's two branches of Porat Yosef, one at the top of Geula and one back in the Old City. But originally, the original spot was in the Old City with an entire neighborhood built around it. The Rebbeim of the yeshiva, the Kollel members of the yeshiva, the married families all lived around this neighborhood. It was a ultra elite yeshiva. This was the flagship yeshiva. I guess we would say the Sephardic equivalent of what we would today call Mir or Brisk or Lakewood, whatever. Pick your favorite flagship yeshiva of the Ashkenazi, Chaim Berliners or whoever you want. Well, I don't want to insult anyone, but for sure it's undisputed that in the Sephardic world it's Porat Yosef and remains so until today. So that the one who instigated that entire project was the Ben Ish Chai. I find it ironic that both the donor, Yosef Avraham Shalom, and the Ben Ish Chai, Rav Yosef Chaim, their name is immortalized in Porat Yosef, in the name of the yeshiva. So that's very appropriate. So he was involved in Eretz Yisrael on that end at the end of his life. Earlier on in life, he already maintained a relationship because of, among his many things he did, the Ben Ish Chai, he was also a Makubal. He maintained a relationship with the Beit El Yeshiva in Yerushalayim, the Kabbalist Yeshiva. We had an episode about this a few months ago, about the Beit El Yeshiva of the Rashash, Rabbi Shalom Sharabi in the old city of Yerushalayim, and the Ben Ish Chai. He maintained a relationship with this yeshiva. He even incorporated some of its Kabbalistic customs into the Baghdad communal customs, which was a great innovation because this was ancient Bavel customs or ancient Sephardic customs, and he was an innovator, and he put some of the Beit El Rashash style Kabbalistic customs into the Baghdad Jewish communal service. But more than that, he also visited the land of Israel in 1869. So in general, the Holy Land was always close to the Ben Ish Chai's heart. He would mention its holiness and greatness often in his public speeches and in his writings. He had his many Sfarim for most of his life, and he published many of his own Sfarim. Some were only published by his son, but grandson even, but most of them were published in his own lifetime by him. And he always had it exclusively published in Yerushalayim in order to support the old yeshiv. He didn't do it in a closer printing press. He took an extra expense and he financed the printing of his own Sfarim. He never fundraised for it or anything like that, which is also quite rare for the time. And he dafka did it in Yerushalayim so as to support the yeshiv. He also oversaw the fundraising apparatus in Baghdad for the Sephardic old yeshiv, and he donated much from his personal funds as well. He also directly instigated the establishment of Porat Yosef in the old city, like I mentioned, through the Calcutta-based philanthropist Yosef Avraham Shalom. But there was more. In 1869, he made a historic visit himself to the land of Israel, which lasted several months. He purchased a home with a vineyard in Hebron so that he could fulfill the mitzvahs pertinent to the land of Israel on his property via a proxy who actually resided there, because the Ben Ish Chai didn't live there. He only came to visit and returned to Baghdad. So the Ben Ish Chai actually may have pioneered the trend of those who own homes in Israel but don't actually live there, which is quite common today. Today you come for a visit, for Sukkot, whatever it is. But the Ben Ish Chai pioneered that idea that you live in Baghdad, you live somewhere else, and you own a home in Israel. He did it to have the mitzvahs hatzluyas ba'aretz in his vineyard in Hebron, but each one in their own way. In the spring of 1869, he and one of his brothers made this pilgrimage to Eretz Yisrael in order to be there, in order to visit Kivrei Tzadikim there. In fact, that was one of the main reasons why he wanted to go, was to go to Kivrei Tzadikim in Israel. In this regard, the Ben Ish Chai pioneered another trend, which is how I make a living, bringing groups to Kivrei Tzadikim. I do it in Israel and all over the world. He came dafka to Israel. In fact, he did it in Baghdad also. I haven't had groups to Iraq yet, but I hope we do, because there's so much history to see there and plenty of Kivrei Tzadikim and loads of other history. I would love to do tours to Iraq one day. Hopefully, sometime in the future, it will become feasible and then we will look forward to pioneering that as well. In any event, the Ben Ish Chai on his visit first spent some time in Damascus in Syria. If you look at a map, when you go from Iraq to Israel, you first bump into Damascus. And he was honorably received by the local rabbinical leadership and the wider Jewish community. He then proceeded south to the Galil, where he spent some time visiting the various different kivrei tzaddikim in the Galil. It was there that he had a transformative life experience, by his own account, at the kever of Beniyahu ben Yehoyada. Beniyahu ben Yehoyada, for those who went to yeshiva, so yeshivas are non-profit institutions, so we don't know Navi, but if you happen to, ask your wives. There in the Navi, it talks about the Beniyahu ben Yehoyada was the chief of staff of Shlomo HaMelech. That's in the Navi Melachim. It talks about this. So Beniyahu ben Yehoyada was this very prominent figure in the Navi, and he was the chief of staff of Shlomo HaMelech's military. And his kever is in the Galil. The Ben Ish Chai spent several days at his kever. With my groups, we're always rushing to the kever and rushing out because we have to make it to the next stop. The Ben Ish Chai spent several days at Beniyahu ben Yehoyada's kever, and when he was finished, he declared to those with him that he received great secrets of Torah there, and that he felt and understands that his shayrish neshama, his soul, emanates from Beniyahu ben Yehoyada. Whatever that means, I'm not a mystic, so I don't know. But I take his word for it because as a historian, we have good sources for it, that it comes straight from the Ben Ish Chai himself. So several prominent works of the Ben Ish Chai were subsequently named by him for the Ben Yehoyada. He named his Beniyahu or Ben Yehoyada or Mikabtziel, different nicknames that the Navi gives for Beniyahu Ben Yehoyada. So several of the Sfarim of the Ben Ish Chai were named for him, and hints to his name as a result of this mystical encounter by his gravesite. He then proceeded to the gravesite of the Tana Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. And while he was there, he wrote a poem, one of his many poems that he wrote, but this one is probably his only famous one today. Va'amartem koilechai Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, which I think is sung worldwide till this very day, and everyone knows this poem, but I assume that most do not know that the Ben Ish Chai is the author of this lofty poem. Everyone sings it. It's appropriate to know who the author was, and it's the Ben Ish Chai. I don't think that he composed the melody, which it is sung to today, but he certainly wrote the words. And in this context, it's worth mentioning that he was a prolific poet, writing over 200 poems, though only 50-something are known today. Now, that's not that common to have such a prominent rabbi in the 19th century. In earlier centuries, we did have many such rabbis, but in the 19th century, it was rather rare, and it adds to his many talents. He seemed to have been capable of doing anything. In any event, he eventually continues to Yerushalayim, where he again has a lavish welcoming ceremony, and a committee of all the great Torah leaders of Yerushalayim came to greet him. You know, they used all kinds of very flowery language. Ari Olami Bavel, a lion has ascended from Bavel, which is Iraq. He was very warmly received. Now, one of his primary motives of his entire visit was to familiarize himself more and learn from also the great Kabbalists of the Beit El Yeshiva. As I mentioned earlier, he had a great liking of this stream of thought. So he spent some time there imbibing from the atmosphere of Jewish mysticism in this prominent institution, which we recently covered in a podcast a few months ago. So he continues his Israel sojourn, his journey, with a stop in Hebron, of course, to daven at the Maris Machpelah, but also his brother-in-law was a famous rabbi, and he was the chief rabbi of Hebron in the 19th century, Rebbe Leo Mani, who's also a great story, and we'll do the Hebron Jewish community one day as well. So there was a familial affiliation added to this visit. There seems to have been another fascinating element to this Hebron visit. It would seem preposterous, but it was reported at the time in the Halavano newspaper, so it must be true. So, I mean, facetious, but it was reported in Halavana, and so presumably it's a true story. It is well known, this part is definitely well known, that the Muslim authorities forbade Jews as infidels, in other words, all non-Muslims, from ascending past the infamous seventh step up to the Maras Machpelah for many, many centuries. I think 8 or 9 centuries, if I'm not mistaken. Jews and any non-Muslims were not allowed to ascend into the Maras Machpelah where we're allowed to go today. They were not allowed to go there for all these years. It was forbidden by the Muslim authorities. They couldn't go past the seventh step. So the Ben Ish Chai thought he'd solve the problem in a similar fashion to the way many on my trips, participants on my trips, they wish to solve all kinds of problems when we encounter historic buildings or historic homes in Europe and other places which are no longer in Jewish hands. So many on my trips, they say right away, a lot of them are in the real estate business, so they say, what's the problem? Let's buy it. How much could it cost already? Let's purchase it. So I always, thought it was funny. But in fact, the participants on my trip are right, because that's exactly what the Ben Ish Chai's reaction was. The Ben Ish Chai said, the Muslim authorities won't allow us to ascend past the seventh step in Maras Machpelah. No problem. We will buy the Maras Machpelah from them, and we'll solve the problem that way. The Ben Ish Chai even already got a donor. He actually tried purchasing it from the Muslims. He got a wealthy Jew in Damascus to commit some funds for the purchase, but shockingly, the Muslim authorities were not interested in the deal, so there went that. But it's fascinating to me that he actually tried. When he returned from his sojourn in the Holy Land, he brought 2 souvenirs back with him to Baghdad. One was a sack of earth, literally dirt, holy dirt. We actually, Davi, Safir, and I, my partner in writing a weekly column for the Mishpacha magazine. So a couple of months ago, we wrote about this commercial phenomenon throughout history of bringing back dirt from Eretz Yisrael to all diaspora communities. So the Ben Ish Chai did that as well. He took that dirt and spread it around his shul so that it should form the floor of the shul where he regularly prayed in Baghdad. And he also, his second souvenir that he brought back with him from Yerushalayim was a stone from Yerushalayim, which he placed on the eastern wall of the same shul. In fact, when he was later buried in Baghdad, they buried him with that stone in 1909 when he passed away. Of course, that's according to the version of the story that he passed away and was buried in Baghdad. There's another legend that he's actually buried on Har HaZeisim, and there's even a matzeva. I show groups on our popular Har HaZeisim tours, which you're welcome to do next time you visit Israel, along with many other historical walking tours that I do in Israel, so be in touch with me for your next visit. But in any event, I show people there's a matzeva on Har HaZeisim that says that the Ben Ish Chai is buried there. So it could very well be that he's on Har HaZeisim, aside from one minor issue that he's not on Har HaZeisim because he's buried in Baghdad. But we can't get to Baghdad today. It's not that easy anyway, so let's pretend he's buried on Har HaZeisim. One day when the tours start to Baghdad, I'll show you his kever in Baghdad. In fact, once we mentioned the Ben Ish Chai's obsession with Kivrei Tzadikim, his obsession continued until the end of his life. He'd periodically pray at the gravesite of Yechezkel HaNavi, which is in Iraq. By the way, there's many, many Kivrei Tzadikim in Iraq as well, some biblical, some more modern. But the kever of Yechezkel HaNavi, the Ben Ish Chai took a particular liking to, and it's some distance from Baghdad, and he was on the way there to pray when he passed away. So he didn't pass away in the city of Baghdad. He was on the road, on his way to going to the kever of Yechezkel HaNavi, and he was returned to Baghdad and buried there. His kever became a popular site of pilgrimage for Iraqi Jewry until the community dwindled later on in the 1950s. Now, getting back to, we just got a whole sidetrack about his trip to Israel in 1869, but if we backtrack to when he assumed the leadership of the Baghdad Jewish community upon his father, Rebbe Leo's passing in 1859. So what was the formal position of the Ben Ish Chai? Incredibly enough, it was not formal. It was informal. It was somewhat informal. He was never officially the chief rabbi. Not only did he not take a salary from the community, he through his brother's business ventures, he financed himself. He even, like I said before, personally financed the publication of his many Sfarim. Not only that, he, like I said also before, he had paid extra to have them published in Yerushalayim to provide parnasa for the poor Jews of Yerushalayim who worked in the printing business. But aside from all funding, he never served as the formally recognized chief rabbi of the city, or even as the Av Beit Din, the head of the rabbinical court in Baghdad either. Rather, it was more of an informal position with some formality, which I'll explain exactly what I mean. He was seen as the final halachic authority in many local issues and beyond Baghdad, and even beyond the borders of Iraq. He was an internationally acclaimed psak who fielded questions from across the Ottoman Empire and even beyond the Ottoman Empire to the East, and Persia, and India. Crucially, he also inherited his father and grandfather's somewhat formal positions as to be the official public speakers to the community. Now, this is a fascinating story. The public speaking position that the Ben Ish Chai inherited from his father and grandfather, that he was eventually to incorporate, became his main expression of leadership in the Baghdad community. For 50 years, like I said, it was to emerge as one of the most important elements of his illustrious career, his influence, and his legacy. Many of his Sfarim, including the entire Ben Ish Chai series, is based on his public discourses, on his public classes. In other words, they're a written summary of his shiurim. So it's interesting that he didn't, many other of his Sfarim, he wrote tons of Sfarim. Many other of his Sfarim were written as books. But many of his Sfarim, including the entire Ben Ish Chai series, were just summaries of oral talks, which gives it a different style. So I want to go through some of his shiurim just to get a glimpse of it. He delivered 2 daily classes. And then he also delivered shiurim on Shabbos, and he had special Torah classes for special occasions. So let's start with the dailies. Every day, for 50 years, following the Vasikin minyan, at sunrise, the sunrise minyan, it's after the Vasikin minyan, he delivered an hour-and-a-half shiur every day on 3 topics. Shulchan Aruch, halacha, Ein Yaakov on the Haggadah and Gemara, and Chayk Yisrael, which is a compendium of all kinds of different areas of Torah that in many Sephardic communities, even many non-Sephardic, many Ashkenazi communities as well, there was a custom to study. So an hour-and-a-half shiur every day on those 3 topics. Every 4 years, he'd complete the entire Shulchan Aruch through these shiurim with his attendees, which is incredible that he went through the entire Shulchan Aruch in 4 years from a daily shiur. And he'd host a lavish meal in celebration of making a siyum on the entire Shulchan Aruch. Okay, that's the morning shiur after Vasikin. Every afternoon, again, for a full half a century, 50 years, following Mincha, he delivered a shiur on the weekly parsha, which was an hour long. So the morning shiur was an hour and a half. The afternoon shiur was only an hour. And that shiur was on the weekly parsha and relevant current topics like the holidays or other things from around the year and things that came up in the community. So in Yonei Diyoima, I could not find a decent source of how many were in attendance for the weekday talks. Okay, but people came, apparently, because he continued to deliver them. So I don't know if it was 5 people or 500 people. I have no idea. But amazing schedule. Then there was the Shabbos, or Shabbat, in Baghdad. Every Shabbos, the Ben Ish Chai delivered a 3-hour talk. Okay, and it was in the small shul in Baghdad. The small shul was known as Salat al-Za'iri, and it was considered small because it only seated 1,000 congregants. So it's that's the small shul. So it seems from the sources that for the Shabbos shiur at least, that the shul was full. It was pretty much full for his talks. So that means 1,000 people came to hear him talk every Shabbos for 3 hours. His 3-hour Shabbos speeches were on the topics of Parshas HaShavua, mixed with halacha, agada, musar, stories, parables, riddles. It was a speech catered to the masses, not to the scholarly folk. Then that was the weekly Shabbos shiur. Then on 4 Shabbos a year, the 4 Shabbos were Shabbos Hagadol, Shabbos Shuva, Shabbos Zachar, and Shabbos Kala, or Shabbat Kala. The Shabbos before Shavuos, or Shavuot, in Baghdad was called Shabbos Kala. And on those 4 Shabbos a year, he'd deliver a speech in the big shul of Baghdad. Remember, the regular weekly Shabbos speech for 3 hours was in the small shul. The 4 Shabbosim a year, he delivered a speech in the big shul, which was known as Salat al-Kabiri. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. And the big shul had 10,000 seats. Amazing. I mean, it possibly was the biggest shul in the world, if that's true. Unbelievable. And it seems that it was overflowing, more than full capacity, for his speeches on these 4 special occasions. And he delivered long general speeches to the wider Baghdad community on those 4 occasions in honor of the upcoming holiday. It was before 4 holidays, correct? So, amazing speech schedule. By all accounts, he was a captivating, dynamic speaker, possessing fine oratory skills. Listeners were riveted to his words, and there was quite a few contemporary accounts. In other words, in real time, people writing about how captivating he was to the audience and what a great speaker he was, and how enjoyable it was to listen to his speeches and entertaining it was. In addition, he was very particular about catering his manners of speech as well as its content to the specific audience he was addressing. Although he was a world-class Talmudic scholar, he was also an acclaimed Kabbalist, he specifically spoke the language of the commoner. He spoke to the people, to the masses, to the community, all levels, all ages. Very basic, very simple, very easily understood. He tried to be entertaining. He tried to pepper his talks with stories and parables and riddles of all sorts, all kinds of rhetorical mechanisms to keep the audience engaged. Really unique in the annals of rabbinical speeches. I can't think of any other example in Jewish history of a speaking record such as his. It's unbelievable. And I'm not sure what's more impressive, the Ben Ish Chai's speaking abilities and scholarly talent, or the fact that the Jews of Baghdad attended these long lectures with such a consistency and seemingly enjoyed it. It seems that no one was required to attend. It was all voluntary. So to me, this is absolutely astounding that on a daily basis, working people would sit for an hour and a half shir after Vasikin, and then an hour shir after Mincha, and then a 3-hour shir on Shabbos. I'm amazed by it. In any event, the Ben Ish Chai's leadership and psak and influence extended across Iraqi Jewry, to Persian Jewry, the Sephardic community in the land of Israel, to India, and other communities. He was a great innovator. Now, that was very unique, because Bavel Jews, as their name implies, they were an ancient Jewish community, and they had always been quite proud of their cultural heritage, and he innovated many new customs and changes into the prayer liturgy, and much of these innovations were based on Kabbalah, specifically the Rashash and the Beit El Yeshiva, which he tended to incorporate into halachic psak, while others were based on his understanding of psak, and he wasn't scared to innovate. Now, due to the high esteem in which he was held in the community, most accepted these innovations as a matter of course. But there were others in Baghdad who publicly opposed him and his methodology of psak halacha. And a great dispute arose as a result, and it spilled over into the Hebrew European press at the time. Interesting. Primarily in the newspaper Hamagid, as well as the Orthodox newspaper Halavonain, which is amazing that the Baghdad inter-halachic disputes comes to the European Hebrew press. Now, within the community, he received much support, with the opposition even eventually being excommunicated and banned from the main shul, which is a fascinating story. Now, related to this is a very famous polemical dispute, which the Ben Ish Chai personally waged with a German European religious maskil, who arrived in Baghdad in the mid-19th century and the late 19th century with his enlightened ideas, a fellow by the name of Yaakov Obermeyer. And this was a very prolonged dispute between the two, between Obermeyer and the Ben Ish Chai, with the Ben Ish Chai defending tradition within the Baghdad community, and eventually seems like he won that dispute. Now, like I said, the Ben Ish Chai's way of psak generated controversy at the time, and then it generated controversy a few generations later in the Sephardic world of late 20th century Israel, almost contemporary times, over the halachic legacy of the Ben Ish Chai, which I find fascinating, that in our own lifetime, the Ben Ish Chai's halachic legacy is being disputed, was disputed like a generation or two ago, wasn't exactly last year, and I want to mention 2 points about this. 2 points need to be made about his methodological approach to halacha. Number 1, he incorporated many Kabbalistic ideas and practices into halacha, especially from the Arizal and especially from the Rashash of the Beit El Mekubalim Yeshiva. He also, this is more surprising, he incorporated ideas and practices into halacha, especially from the, he incorporated many piskei halacha of the Ramah, the Ashkenazi Ramah, into Sephardic Iraqi psak, even though fundamentally he, the Ben Ish Chai, like every other psak in the Sephardic world, preferred Maran Bet Yosef, right? But still, the Ben Ish Chai surprisingly incorporated some halachic psak of the Ramah. The second thing I want to point out is that the halachic sfarim of the Ben Ish Chai, not all of them, but at least the bulk of them, do not appear as a systematic halachic commentary based on the order of the Shulchan Aruch. They are rather based on summaries of his public lectures, so they are largely framed around the weekly Torah portion. They don't follow a particular order or organizational structure, and they are full of associative ideas, mystical ideas, gematrias, and other Jewish type of homiletic styles, which is from the public speech style. Now, famously, Rav Yosef, he himself was a native of Baghdad, he waged a decades-long, largely successful campaign to steer Sephardic psak away from the Ben Ish Chai and away from his legacy, and a return to what the Rav Yosef said, to Maran Bet Yosef, to the Shulchan Aruch. And what the Rav used to say, Lahachzir atara liyoshna, to restore the crown of glory to Maran Bet Yosef, and away from the Ben Ish Chai, despite that he had great respect and held the Ben Ish Chai in very high esteem. But he saw the Ben Ish Chai as an innovator, and we're going to return the Sephardic world to the Shulchan Aruch, to Maran Bet Yosef. Other Sephardic rabbis, such as Rav Mordechai Eliyahu, whose parents were from Baghdad, and Rabbi Sion Abba Shaul, who's actually from Persia originally, and many other poskim in the Sephardic community, maintained that the Ben Ish Chai had already emerged as somewhat of a posik achron of sorts, the latter-day posik, and the Sephardic world had accepted the Ben Ish Chai as their posik, or at least Iraqi and other communities. I don't know about the whole Sephardic world. There's other elements of the Sephardic world that didn't. But crucially, the Kaf HaChaim, which is a major posik in the Sephardic community, largely goes to Ben Ish Chai as well, and he has had a decisive impact on the Sephardic psak too. Having said that, Rav Yosef was largely successful with his endeavor, and there's lots to say about that, but that's more of a story about the leadership and power of Rav Yosef. I'm going to go back to the Ben Ish Chai. The Ben Ish Chai wrote tens and tens of svarim on a huge array of topics across the gamut of Torah literature, a massive literary output that's almost unmatched in the Jewish world. Perhaps a handful of other authors throughout Jewish history can match the sheer number and breadth of the works of the Ben Ish Chai, but not more than a handful. The Ben Ish Chai was succeeded after his passing in 1909 by his son, Rav Yosef Chaim, and he continued to publish the works of his father following his passing. He also this Rav Yosef Chaim also succeeded his father's positions within the Iraqi Jewish community. He passed away 12 years later and was succeeded in 1921, and was succeeded by his son, Reb David Chaim. Now, Reb David Chaim is a real interesting story on his own merits, and it's also connected to his grandfather. This Reb David Chaim is already the 5th generation father to son to hold this informal position in Baghdad. He serves in this unofficial rabbinical position from 1921 to 1973, a period of 52 years, longer than his grandfather, and it's a period of great upheaval for Iraqi Jewry, which we'll get to when we do an episode on Iraqi Jewry, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the rise of British colonialism, the rise of the Iraqi monarchy, the rising anti-Semitism in the 1930s, the infamous Farhud pogrom against the Jews of Baghdad, and many were killed in 1941, the establishment of the State of Israel, Operation Ezra Nehemiah, and the emptying of the Iraqi Jewish community from Iraq to the early state of Israel. And this Rabbi David Chaim continues and stays in Baghdad the entire time. Even after the entire community leaves in the early 1950s, he stays. He feels he has a responsibility as the rabbi and the leader for the diminished and dwindling Iraqi Jewish community. He stays. Finally, 1973, when there's almost no Jews left in Iraq, he leaves Iraq for a short stint in London before moving to Israel. And when he leaves, he smuggles many unpublished manuscripts of his grandfather, the Ben Ish Chai, his writings, with him when he flees Iraq. So he dedicates the rest of his life to publishing them in Israel. And he published many unpublished, unknown writings of the Ben Ish Chai when he arrived. He passed away at the age of 95 in 1983, and he's buried in Bnei Brak. This was about the Ben Ish Chai. You can help the Jewish History Soundbites podcast by just spreading the word, telling your friends and family and others, and encouraging them to listen to the podcast. Leave a rating and review about the podcast. Also, you can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on your favorite podcast platform. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. And I hope you enjoyed.